seated. Part 2 of our message, Becoming Disciples, Living Questionable Lives. We could get really stressed out if we looked too long at Matthew chapter 28. The scripture passage that I preached on last week is to go and make disciples of all nations. This can evoke physical manifestations of stress. Our heart can start to race when we think about having to go and make disciples. Our blood pressure might spike, and we might get the all too familiar butterflies in our stomach. Do I have to go? What do I have to say? What do I have to do? But I have good news for every one of you that doesn't have the gift of evangelism. Sharing your faith doesn't have to cause a coronary. Isn't that nice to know? Ephesians chapter 4 verse 11 says this. It says, He gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be pastors and teachers. You notice I've underlined that one word there, some. Why is it that we recognize not everyone's called to be a pastor, but somehow we presume that everyone is supposed to be an evangelist? There goes everybody's phone. Take a look at that. See what it is. Last flood watch popped up on mine. Severe thunderstorm coming our way. Good. We don't have to go to safety. We're safe as we can be. All right. You remember, it was probably 40 years ago that sweeping through the church was evangelism explosion. And we thought and trained and believed that everybody in the church ought to be trained in evangelism explosion, which was basically just learning how to ask 3 questions. The first one of which, if you were to die today, do you know for certain that you would go to heaven? That's a great question to know and to be able to ask at the right moment. But Evangelism Explosion encouraged people to speak to total strangers and begin with this question: if you were to die today, as though I'm going to be taking part in it, do you know you'd go to heaven? You know, it happens more often than not that evangelism best takes place in the process of a relationship. And that most people come to church for the first time because a friend asked them. And most people come to faith in Jesus because someone they knew and someone who cared about them witnessed to them, maybe not so much with words, but with their lives. Scripture says that God gave some as evangelists. That one word, some, gives me a chance to exhale, not exile, exhale, and to breathe and to say, oh, okay, I don't have to be a prophet. I don't have to be an apostle. I don't have to be an evangelist. And yet, there are some. Several years ago, as a congregation, we took spiritual gifts tests together. And you know, in all of about 40 people took that test. In all of those tests, there was one person who had evangelism as a very high spiritual gift. And there was one other person who had evangelism as a third spiritual gift. That was all there was in the congregation. And we started to wonder if we were ever going to be able to make disciples. But if the Scripture is right, only some of us are called to be evangelists. Now, we're all called to make disciples. But only some of us are called to stand on the street corner and proclaim, or on the always, and proclaim to those who haven't asked the message of Jesus. If few of us have the gift of evangelism, how can we still fulfill the commission that Jesus gave us to make disciples? How can we reproduce the faith in the next generation? But maybe we should be living questionable lives. When I asked if you were living questionable lives, some of you may have gotten the defensive. Well, who's he to ask me if I'm living questionable lives? Usually when we think of something being questionable, and we think of actions or behaviors that might be unbecoming of those who claim to be a follower of Jesus. Last week I was talking to my dad about Uncle Bob. And my Uncle Bob lived most of his life outside the church. My Uncle Bob didn't have much time for church or religion. But at some point in his life, my Uncle Bob recognized what he had been taught as a young man. And he came to faith, redeeming faith, changing faith. And he was attending this little church. It was a very conservative church. And during the time of testimony, he got up and he thanked God for all that he had done in his life and for the wonderful things he had done to change him and transform him. And then he sat back down, thankful for the opportunity to give God the glory. But on the way out of church that morning, one of the older members of the congregation came alongside my Uncle Bob and said, "You know, I'd be ashamed to stand and tell what God had done for me if I had a pack of smokes in my front pocket." Which one of them was living a negatively questionable life? The one who was on the way and that God was still working on to take care of his nicotine addiction, or the one who was casting judgment? See, there are lots of ways to live questionable lives, but that's not the kind of questionable life that I want you to lead. I don't want you to be questioning other people's lives. And I don't want you to live in a way so that people question whether or not you're a Christian. What I want you to do is to follow Peter's advice to us in his first epistle. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16 says this, "But in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience." You see, living a questionable life doesn't have anything to do with immorality or possible sin. Because if Peter says that we're prepared to give an answer, then someone has to ask the question. What is it about you that makes you so different? Someone sees your life and your lifestyle and they question you. Why did you do that? What makes you love people so much? If we're living lives that are different from the world around us, we don't have to trumpet our horn because people will notice and they'll come ask and they'll question us about what it is that makes us different. We don't have to shout it from the mountaintops that we've been changed. We don't have to continually state all of the things that we don't do, because all of the things that we do will speak volumes to those people who don't know and don't understand what it means to be a disciple. And then they will ask. But now there is something for you to do. You must live that life that is so different from those around you. Not by what you don't do, but by what you do. Throughout the next weeks, I'm going to present you with 5 habits of highly missional people, to give you some way that you can go in your unique circumstance and live out a missional life that causes people to ask the question. Questionableness of life doesn't come from those who think they're holy. Instead, it comes from those who know they aren't holy, and they're asking you, how can I find what you have? Our lives, our actions, our attitudes as believers are so different from the people around us. From anyone else that they've ever met, that they must confront us. What is it that makes you different from everybody else in my life? How come you don't give up on me? How come you don't preach to me like those other people? How come you give when nobody else would? What has happened to you that you've changed from the person that you used to be? You see, our lives should be lived in stark contrast with the prevailing culture. So much so that people are drawn to us and they question us about why. And in that regard, Peter says this: live so that others will question your faith, but when they question you, be prepared with an answer. Now, isn't it so much better when people ask you questions than when you ask them what might be an awkward question at an awkward time in an awkward way? If your actions and your attitudes and behaviors are loud enough for someone to notice the difference, you won't have to preach a word to them. Instead, they'll come to you. So, are you living a questionable life? Do you have an answer for those who would come to you and ask about that thing which makes you so different from the world around you? You see, this is the first step in being a disciple who makes disciples. Living a questionable